author of, and is the author of Yoga of the Planets, of course, which he kindly signed for me a few years ago. And of course, he is a very accomplished Vedic astrologer. As a president and co-founder of Bhava, as we all know. He's been studying and teaching Jyotish for over 30 years now. And of course, he's the software developer and the brains behind Sri Jyotish Star, which is the gold standard for software. And he writes, consults and teaches and lectures, and he has a great gift of making complex Jyotish subjects very easy to understand and it's a great talent to be able to do that, to take complex ideas and translate them into, simple ways that people can understand, irrespective of their level of Jyotish expertise. So Andrew's going to be talking about some Raj Yogas, I believe. So without further ado, Andrew, over to yourself.
Thank you so much. That was an extremely nice introduction. I think that's the nicest I've ever received. Thank you very much, Paul. I'll just do one or two mantras. Om Gam Ganapataye Namah. Om Gam Ganapataye Namah. Om Gam Ganapataye Namah. Aim Guru Saraswatyaya Namah. Great, so thank you all for coming. And thank you to Paul for organizing this wonderful conference. It's a very rare thing that we have a conference on spirituality. And it's a delight, really. I mean, for me, I know we don't get a huge turnout, but you get the gems, the people who are really interested in spirituality. So I must admit it was a bit of a leap in the dark in as well to say I was going to do a talk on Jyotish and the Yoga Sutras. But it's such a privilege. And I've been spending several months studying the Yoga Sutras again. I mean, I thought that I've been reading them for decades, but this recent review really opened my eyes to many things. It's an amazing text. So, by way of introducing myself, Paul already mentioned the book and the software. So, Jyotish and yoga have a very deep interface. Yoga shows us how to develop that consciousness that can know the past, present, and future directly. So it's possible to know the past, present, and future directly. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But then the question may arise, of course, if you're really established in that yogic state, there's no doubt in your mind. It's just whatever you know it's correct. But still, someone else might say, is it your illusion? Intuition, psychics, all this thing, they say things, this is going to happen. And the question is really, is it going to happen? So the wonderful thing about Jyotish is we've actually got a scientific approach where we can at least get some kind of exactness regarding the past and the future. So that lines up with one's intuition or one's visions or one's dreams or whatever it is, then that gives us more confidence. And it could give other people more confidence in anything we've said. So, and then even for the person who has the intuition, suppose you see something, and I'm going to give an example later on about somebody who had a series of visions, all of which came true, but the vision didn't tell him when it would come true or anything more than he saw. You see, the psychic, for example, may see something but that's all they see. What they see is what they see. And of course, it's only a small fragment of the whole of the experience. And part of that is when it's going to happen. So this is where Jyotish has a contribution, even for those with refined consciousness, that we can see the whole progression and we can see many details. Sometimes it helps if you have some kind of a vision, because there's so many possible interpretations of any Jyotish combination that, you know, if you have a little bit of a clue, it helps a lot. So anyway, so what is it? Now, what can Jyotish do for yoga? Anything at all? Well, I would say that if you are a yoga practitioner and you're also doing Jyotish, Jyotish is a kind of intellectual yoga in a sense. We're quietening the mind by seeing the reality. You know, you look at the chart, you realize these are the planets at the time of birth. So it's just some kind of moment of reality, we can say. It's a sort of objective moment. So where am I in all of this? This is the core question. And what you realize is it's just the environment in which you were born. And when you realize that there's this subjective reality and the objective reality, and that one is not the victim of the other, then that can help you relax. I mean, you see, everyone who does Jyotish sees this. You know, if you explain nicely to someone, even if not everything is like wonderfully perfect, but so often you can see the person relaxing because they begin to see that their whole life makes some sense, and it's, you know, they're being seen basically. So I think Jyotish can help us quiet the mind, and then it helps us overcome our internal obstacles. You know, human beings are famous for one great ability, which is denial, I would say. So I think it's our greatest ability. So if there's something that doesn't quite fit the world view that we've accumulated through our past experience, then we either don't see it, and it's so often that we actually cannot see something other than what we expect to see. I mean, this is actually how the brain is programmed. You know, this famous example of or experiment with cats. So one group of cats were brought up in an environment where there are only horizontal lines, and another group were brought up in an environment there were only vertical lines. And when they were released into the normal world, it turned out that they could only see what they'd been brought up in. So that those that were brought up with horizontal lines would keep banging into the legs of tables and things. They just couldn't see it, you see. So on some level, this is true for all of us, and it's something we should be mindful of, you know, whether we like to call it prejudice or whatever we like to call it. But it's just something to do with the way we're programmed. And it's because we can't handle seeing everything. We can only process a small amount of information out of all of the information that's coming in. And so we rely heavily on what we've learned before to kind of fit the world and understand it. But this is all leads us into a state where we often, if things are changing quickly, then we can be caught out. And this is the problem with the world right now, because, you know, my generation, and several of you I didn't see you also from my generation, we grew up with a certain type of actually rather beautiful world. But we were very fortunate. I think in the history of, if anyone ever writes the history of mankind, then the baby boomer generation will probably be flagged as the most fortunate, because we grew up in a beautiful world. We had all sorts of advantages, comforts and things. And we missed out on the terrible wars of the first half of the 20th century and before. And we probably are going to miss out on the terrible things that may happen to our children and grandchildren as a result of all the carbon dioxide that we supervised being pumped into the environment. But anyway, anyway, so that's fine. But with Jyotish, at least it helps us a bit get over this, because you can actually look at the thing and you say, actually, there is something here, especially if somebody else looks at your chart. I mean, it's so easy to look at our own charts and miss things, right? Someone else looks at your chart, says something, then you have to admit it's true. I never noticed that. Yeah. So anyway. Now, spiritual advancement. I mean, all of you are very spiritually advanced, but just as a point of reference for the talk. So we have various levels. There's the vegetable kingdom and the animal kingdom. And even within the animal kingdom, there's some variations. And then there's the humans, sort of typical humans. And then humans have a huge range. Like animals may have a small range, but humans have this huge range. And that range encompasses the complete range. In other words, the divine beings who are perhaps living in some other planet or somewhere, who are way above the average human, are still below the rishis. And even the advanced yogis, they have a status which is higher than spiritually than those people who are maybe living in some heaven somewhere, some Swargaloka. So this is the whole idea of the Yoga Sutras, is to help us go from the typical human level all the way up to the level of the rishis, to the ultimate level, we could say. So this is the textbook for this. Now, the Yoga Sutras are a system of aphorisms. Aphorism, sutra, the Sanskrit word sutra in English, we usually say aphorism. So it's a short expression which contains a sort of immense amount of wisdom in it. It's sort of compactified into a brief expression. So obviously unpacking that and trying to understand it requires a considerable mental clarity, and usually the guidance of a guru. Sutras are supposed to be taught and understood in the context of a guru. Now we have various sutras. There are many, and all the sutras are very profound. There's the Brahma Sutras, but particularly we have the Jaimini Sutras and we have the Yoga Sutras. And it's believed that they were both written by the same author in different incarnations. It is thought that the great Naga, the Lord Vishnu is said to be resting on this snake. I mean, it's a symbol, it's symbolic, right? But there is some great power, maybe whether we like to call it Kundalini, Shakti, whatever we like to call it, or the Ananta, the endless one. And that power has been said to take birth, usually when God takes birth, like Lord Rama takes birth and Lakshmana comes with him, and Lakshmana is said to be Ananta. So then Lord Krishna takes birth, Balarama, his brother, comes with him, who is also said to be Ananta. And when Balarama left, he was at the beach and he just turned into this giant, enormous white snake and disappeared into the ocean. So then the same thing is said of Patanjali, the author of the Yoga Sutras, and Jaimini, the author of the Jaimini Sutras, including the Mimamsa Sutras that were discussed earlier today. And it's said that Ketu has Jaimini Gotra. Gotra means the family. The idea is that the humanity was started by a small group of rishis and their wives, of course. And then they were like tribes. And of course, the tribes interbred. But there's the concept of a Gotra is that you belong to a particular rishi's tribe. And so there are many Gotras, but the core Gotras are all related to the famous rishis. So Ketu is the only one that amongst the planets is said to be coming from the Jaimini Gotra. So basically what the rishis of Jyotish are telling us is that there's some very special connection between Ketu and Jaimini and this high spiritual power, because Ananta is the great spiritual power, and Patanjali. So Patanjali, when you see a statue of Patanjali, then the lower part of the body is that of a snake and the upper part is human. So it's exactly Ketu, isn't it? Ketu is the one with the snake body and the human head. Now there's also a connection to Ganesha. Of course, Ganesha has the elephant head and the human body, but he's also connected to Ketu. You know, in Jyotish, we typically connect Ketu to Ganesha. And in the Yoga Sutras, there is this word swa. Swa means the self. I mean, it's to be found all throughout the literature, spiritual literature, but we have swamsha, right? We have the amsha or position of the self, which is the karaka, atma karaka. And the number that we get from the word swa is 4, and 4 is the number of the Ganesha. You know, we have Ganesha worship on the 4th day of the lunar month. And then we've also seen that 4 is the critical number for the Jaimini Sutras and the Yoga Sutras. So the Jaimini Sutras consists of 4 chapters, and each chapter has 4 sections. And so it was traditionally taught over a period of 16 years, which works out at about 1 sutra per week. So 4 by 4, you see. So then the Yoga Sutras is 4 chapters. There are no sections, so it's just 4 chapters, and each chapter has so many verses. So this number 4 is very critical. Of course, 4 is the core number in Jyotish because there are 4 kendras. At the Muladhara chakra, which is the root chakra, there are 4 petals in the lotus, in the Mula. In those 4 petals are the 4 kendras, and all the other houses kind of emerge out of those 4 kendras. You know, they're all trines to the kendras, the angles. So this 4, that's why Ganesha is the lord of the earth element in the Muladhara chakra, because that is the place of the 4, right? So it's interesting, all the interconnections. Okay, so now the 4 chapters of the Yoga Sutras. The Yoga Sutras is the core textbook of yoga. Now, of course, the other critical book for yoga is the Bhagavad Gita, Yoga Shastra. It's stated very clearly that it's the Shastra or scripture of yoga. So these 2 are the primary texts, but there are many other texts like Hatha Yoga, Pradipika, and others, which deal with more details in a way of the practices and all that. But they're all more recent. The ancient texts are the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita. So there are 4 chapters, and the first one is called Samadhi Adhyaya chapter. So now usually it's translated by concentration, but we should be very careful not to think of this as some kind of straining the brain, you know. Forcing yourself to concentrate on something usually leads to a headache. So that's not what meant at all, you see. The first chapter is taking you from whatever state you're in to that state experience of samadhi, which is the even state of the dhi or intellect, which means that the mind is quiet. That's what it means. And we'll go into what happens when the mind becomes quiet, but that is the first chapter. So samadhi is the first target. We say target number 1. It's definitely not the whole story. It's just the initial goal. Then there's sadhana, which is translated as practice. But of course, in the first chapter, the whole practice of how to achieve samadhi is taught. So, but the way it's presented, you see that real sadhana, we all talk about sadhana, you know. I mean, there's so many sadhanas that are taught in various, even Jyotish courses. And we think sadhana is just some practice. But from the Yoga Sutras, we see sadhana is really what happens once the samadhi is established. Once that quiet state of the mind is there, then there's a whole process of waking up that's going on the basis of that calmness. So that's the sadhana from the Yoga Sutras point of view. And then having achieved that next stage of awakening, then certain powers, certain abilities of vision appears. And these are like ash. You know, the vibhuti means it's a bit like ash. So it's a sort of sprinkling around the flame, you know, the little ash particles that appear out of the flames of a fire. I mean, this is just my take on it, but these powers and all are just something that arises in the process of moving towards the ultimate goal. And they include things such as touring the universe and visiting anywhere you want to go, because it's considered that you should do that. I mean, it actually says, you know, there's something that the yogi should do, because it's like a bucket list. I mean, how many of us have not wanted to see something of other galaxies or other solar systems and all that? No, go and have a look. Please. And, you know, the whole idea is go out, see everything what there is, all the lokas, all this, that, and that, whatever you have any kind of residual interest in. And after some time, you will have seen it all. It's all the same everywhere anyway. And then that is completely silenced that sort of, you know, whatever residual desire you have in that area. And then so many other areas. But there's that particular one. That's due to the meditation on the sun, actually. You get to see all the lokas. And then you can meditate on the pole star, as it were, and then you get to see the whole way the machinery of the universe works, and so forth. So these are all part of the Vibhuti chapter. And then having been through all of that, you know, flying and becoming invisible and all those things, then it's kind of over, you know, you've tasted all those things, and then it's all left behind. And then there's the last chapter, there's the development of Kaivalya, which is the ultimate state, where all the Maya, because it's all a big Maya, it's just one big drama. It's just that drama is found in different places in different ways, isn't it? You know, if you suppose you think, I'm going to go on holiday to the Seychelles, you go to the Seychelles, there's a different drama over there. Maybe the food is different, and the climate is different. So it's just all these different dramas. So at some point, it's kind of like you had it with the dramas. And the silence is really intensifying. But in this last chapter, a number of very profound sutras. I mean, they're all very profound, but I was struck by the amount of depth of the things that were explained in that last chapter. So anyway, we'll touch on that a little bit. So the first, as I mentioned, the first 4 sutras are somehow important because of 4. Of course, we discussed 4. And the first sutra of any text is always, in a way, the most critical, because it contains a sort of highly compactified version of the whole book. So, you know, the first sutra of the Jaimini Sutras is an absolute genius. I mean, the layer after layer after layer of knowledge in that first sutra. And most people look at it and say, oh yeah, so this thing is now being explained, and they move on to the rest of the chapter, right? How many people really stop and look at that first sutra? But it's just extraordinary. And the more you look at it, the more you see. I mean, I'm sure I've only just scraped the surface, you know. But anyway, this is, now we're doing the Yoga Sutras, not the Jaimini Sutras. So this is the first sutra, Atta Yoganushasanam. So Atta means here and now. This is what we're going to do, yoga. So he's giving the name of the discipline to be studied, Anushasanam, which is the practice. So he's making it extremely clear that this is a textbook of the practice. It's not philosophy. You know, you can have a textbook that's primarily philosophy, like the Mimamsikas are mostly philosophy, I would say. But here, I mean, I don't want to diminish them, they're huge and extraordinary, but it's very clear that this is the practice that is being, or the instructions for yoga that are being taught. And he starts immediately, Yoga Chitta Vritti Niroda. This is probably the most famous of all the Yoga Sutras. And it tells us exactly what yoga is. Yoga is a state of the mind, or the experience which is free of mental modifications. In other words, the mind has to become quiet. Niroda. So sometimes people translate this as restraining the modifications of the mind. Now, restraint is probably not the best word. I mean, what we want is to spontaneously achieve a state of peace in the mind. I was listening to a talk the other day, and there was this saint, and you know, some neurologists from Harvard and all were visiting him, and or he was visiting them, I'm not sure, but anyway, there was this discussion, and they started bugging him, you know, like, please let us wire you up and see what happens when you're meditating. So he said, well, I don't meditate. I'm just, you know, I can sit quietly for you, but there's no meditation anymore. So they wired him up, and he sat quietly. I mean, he closed his eyes, and he was sitting quietly. Then he said he felt this sort of like people pushing him, like pushing. So he just sort of thought, well, that was an accident. He just went on. I mean, he didn't think. He just went on sitting there with his eyes closed, and then they pushed. So I opened his eyes. He said, our machines are telling us you're dead. In other words, it just went flat. The EEG and all just went flat. I had I've got a friend who's at the University of Virginia here in Charlottesville, and he has an EEG machine. He was measuring lots of people, and he took it to some retreat at a nearby retreat center, and he did some measurements. And one person, he saw this flatlining. It just went quiet for a short period. This was not like a great yogi. It was just some advanced meditator. So this is a reality that there is a state of the brain which is just like in quiescent state. And that is a state of absolute pure bliss and consciousness for the experiencer. So that's the state of yoga. Now, in terms of the Jyotish, I think we have to relate this to the fourth house, because that's the place of Shanti. What happens when the brain stops shouting and goes quiet is you experience state of perfect peace, Shanti. So Shanti is found in the fourth house, and the indicators of it are the fourth house, the fourth lord, the moon, which is the karaka of the fourth house, and its sign, which we could say is the Cancer, the fourth sign. Now that's maybe Cancer's, you can consider that or not as you like, but it's relevant. So if we look at any chart, and this is standard Jyotish, we're all doing it, I'm sure. You want to see how happy the person is, how peaceful they are, how calm they are, or what sufferings they have. And mainly, we're just seeing what are the malefic influences on the fourth house. You know, all those malefic influences are obstacles that have to be worn away. And yoga is the way of wearing them away. That's the whole purpose of this first chapter on samadhi, is to wear away at those when I have Saturn in the fourth house. Only those who have Saturn in the fourth house can appreciate what you have to live with. But anyway, so I got into yoga early because I thought I have to do something. And I developed this slogan when I was a teenager. It said, the only way out is in. And I didn't know anything about Vedas, yogas, nothing. I just went to the church and started praying. After a while, somebody showed up and taught me meditation. So that was, how I started working on the shani. But anyway, this is where we can understand really what the obstacles to yoga are, I think, primarily. Because in my other talk, Bhava, fourth house, 8th house, and 12th house, the path to joy, the starting point is the fourth house. So that's where you have to begin your work, as it were. Work, I guess, is a typical shani expression. It doesn't inspire the sense of bliss, but if your mind becomes quiet, you get the bliss for sure. And if you look at the charts of, I think pretty much every meditator, significant meditator, there's always something to do with shani and the moon, isn't there? So, to some degree, because shani is, after all, the sorrow, but he's also the one who says, shut up and close your eyes. So, and if your moon isn't influenced by shani in any way, why would you close your eyes after all, other than to sleep? Anyway, that's a small observation. I haven't done a scientific research on that. Here's the third sutra, Tada Drashtu Swarupe Avasthanam. So this is a fantastic sutra. Tada, as a result of that calm state of the mind. So there's this quiet state of the mind, and then drashtu, that means there's an experiencer present. It's not a state of sleep where there's no experience. There's an experiencer, the drashtu. And what is the experiencer experiencing? Himself, swa. Swarupa. He's in the form of himself, established in that. So established in that yogic state, he knows himself. So the self-realization arises when the brain becomes quiet. This is what he's telling us. So we want to know who we really are. We have to just find some way of calming the brain down to the point that it just is capable of at least a moment of silence. If there is an actual experience of a moment of silence, there will be a shaft of light of some kind, some kind of little flicker of self-realization. All of us, I'm sure, have experienced this. I see some very experienced meditators and others in the group. So I'm just preaching to the choir here, but the yogic process is to help us make this more substantial. So what happens in this quiet state if you start thinking again? Because you will start thinking again. It's bound to happen. So this is the next step. And I wanted to mention here that there's a lot about this experience in the Bhagavad Gita also. And it's really the secret. And also Vaksiddhi, like every astrologer wants to have Vaksiddhi, right? Vaksiddhi is that whatever you say comes true. So you tell somebody, this and this will happen, it should happen. Now, if you really have Vaksiddhi, even if he wasn't destined to have it, he gets it because you said it, it has to happen, right? All the angels are now running around on overtime trying to make sure that thing happens. So this is a bit dodgy, you see. You have to be a bit careful as you develop your yogic power. What you say is, you have to be careful because the angels might not, be too grateful being given much work to do. So this is the fourth sutra, Vritti Sarupya Mitratra. So vritti, that means now there was that samadhi, and now the vritti has appeared, some thought has arisen. And what happens? Well, this is very interesting because there's two possibilities here. One is either you get absorbed in that thought and that state of self-awareness disappears. This is what happens to us, mostly all of us, except for the high-powered ones. You know, you have a moment of awareness, then you're caught up in some thoughts. So this is one possibility that's mentioned in this sutra. But there's also another possibility, which is that as the thought arises, this awareness of the self is not lost. Now, in both cases, you see, Vritti Sarupya Mitratra is telling us that whatever you see, you become. This is Maharshi Mahesh Yogi's slogan for this sutra, or a translation. So you see, when you experience something at a very fine level, you literally become it. It's like you take the form of that. Sarupya, Vritti Sarupya, you're taking the form of that thing that you're experiencing. And when you take the form of it, you know it, because only like as Maharshi used to say, only a rose knows what it's like to be a rose. So if your awareness takes the form of the rose, then you actually experience what it's like to be a rose. And then if you wish, you can find out everything about that rose, like its entire history and future. All of that will reveal itself to you because you become it. So this is the sort of secret of knowing anything. And one of the ways of practicing this, by the way, is to just sit quietly and look at something and just keep looking at it. So you say like some flower or some leaf or anything. And if you sit for long enough, you'll gradually start to feel it. And as bit by bit, the revelation will come. So this is the first teaching. And that is also, it's cultivating. See, if you sit quietly and look at something, then your mind tends to become quiet, because why should the brain consume more energy than it needs to? It doesn't choose to do that. So it's gradually, the trouble is that we've collected so much stuff. I mean, when you've looked at anything, suppose you watch some TV program, then for some time afterwards, surely some memories and thoughts related to that thing keep coming up. So there's a sort of clutter that goes on for some length of time. And if we only watch one thing on the TV once a week, then there's some time after some days where kind of that thing is faded off. But if we watch something every day, like most of us do, it's a continuous sort of background chatter, isn't it? So we have to decide what we want. Maybe we're not prepared to sacrifice the TV. I haven't gone that far myself. So anyway, so this is the concept of the knower knowing the known, becoming the known. So this is what I just explained. Later on in chapter 141, there it gives more detail on this experience. It says it's like a absolutely pure crystal. The crystal is colorless. You bring something close to it, which has some color, and then you see that the crystal is taking on the color of that thing. So this is the example given by the Yoga Sutras for what is happening in consciousness when a quiet consciousness experiences anything. So whatever you remember at that time in that quietness, you get a profound understanding or knowledge of it. So if you're stuck with any issue, Jyotish problem, like you've got a chart and you really can't make out something, sit quietly with it. All right, now we've got on to, this is the process of the first chapter is what I've simplified vastly, but it's that sort of sitting quietly and attending to something gradually develops that samadhi. It's worth going through it in detail, but we only have a little bit of time. So in the beginning of the second chapter, it explains what the obstacles are. So that it cites 5 obstacles. Avidya, which is usually translated as ignorance, lack of knowledge. Asmita, which is ego. Raga, attraction or attachment. Dvesha, aversion. And abhinivesha, the fear of death. So these are only 5 things that we have to get over. I mean, it's good there's only 5, right? Of course, 5 is a fabulous number in Jyotish. We have lots of, it makes us think about the Bhutas and all that. But this is a little different. So the root of all of these things is ignorance, because if you didn't have the ignorance, you definitely wouldn't be afraid of death. The fear of death is completely a result of the misunderstanding of the reality. And the first thing that comes when you haven't got that clear cognition of reality is this ego sense. It just arises spontaneously. You can't get rid of the ego unless the avidya is removed. And it's always the last thing to go. It is absolutely the last thing to go. The final stage of kaivalyam is the disappearance of the ego. We'll talk more about that in terms of the different bodies which we have. And then there's attachment or attraction and aversion. So if you look at life, it's built into the intelligence of every cell that it moves towards sources of food and it moves away from sources of pain or disturbance. And since every cell in our body is doing that, it's not really surprising that we do it as a being, a unified being, we also do it. So that's all going on, and it's all going on because we have the sense of I, and the I comes from the avidya. And because we're running away from danger, we're running towards some pleasures, then naturally we're afraid of dying. It might bring the whole thing to an end. But all of that's all very fine. And the whole Jyotish chart is all about our attachment and aversion and fear of death. But what is the root? The root is this kind of mistake that thinks that the mind and the intellect primarily are the self. You ask somebody, who are you? They say, oh, I'm Mr. So-and-so, and this is my house, and this is my father, and this is my job. And they give a whole lot of stuff which has nothing to do with him. It's just stuff he's collected along the way. So this idea that I am the body, I am the mind, I am this life, this is the avidya. It's of course it's useful for conversation, but it's not the truth. That at least we should accept that. Somebody asked me who I am. Andrew Foss. I mean, it sounds a bit peculiar to me to use that expression, but it is a way of communicating and dealing with people. It's all very fine, but we shouldn't be conned into thinking that that is the truth. It's not the truth. It's just a label someone stuck on you, and he wasn't even there when you were born. Most people don't have a label when they're born. It just gets attached after a few days or something. Sutras, chapter 2, sutras 7 to 9. The Patanjali explains each of these. So first he explains avidya as the root and its cause, which is this confusion of identifying the self with the non-self. Then he says attachment results from the remembrance of pleasure. Like we think we enjoyed something, so we want some more. Like the first taste of some food is really good. Then we say, I like that food. But if someone forces us to eat some huge quantity of it, we become sick. I used to be so crazy over cream. And, it's just my thing was this, rich, heavy cream, And then one day I was in Zambia, of all places, where people are not, you don't think of them as having an excess of anything, but I was with this doctor and he produced for breakfast, he gave me a whole bowl which was just the thickest, freshest, richest cream. But it was an awful lot of it. And I was seriously ill after I'd eaten that. So anyway, that's then misery, and that gives straight to aversion. So we oscillate between the attachment and the aversion. And then Patanjali says that the fear of death is in all creatures. It's not something we learn. It's sort of built in by virtue of getting a body. And he says even the learned have the fear of death, despite the inherent sense of something immortal. We all have some sense of immortality, you see. I mean, it's the very remarkable thing about all of us is that at least until we start suffering from some disease or something, we all think we're immortal. You know, death is something that happens to other people. And the reason for this isn't just that we're stupid. It's actually because the core of everybody's being is immortal. That's my view. You know, my view is that there's a sense of the immortality. And then, of course, we identify with the body. The body starts hurting. After a while, the hurting becomes quite, difficult to bear with. And then we start thinking, well, I quite like to lose, let's let this body go, you see. So, but that's all to do with the body. The sense, actual core is immortal. That's what we all sense. And it's also true. So, but despite that, we're still all generally afraid of death. You know, there's this story given about Vyasa. So he observes this worm crossing the road, and he says to the worm, and there are carts coming along the road. So the worm is struggling to get out of the way of the cart because the cart crosses, it would crush it, kill it, you see. So Vyasa says to the worm, because he's a great saint, he can talk to worms. So he says, look, being a worm is a pretty lousy deal. Why are you so worried about being crushed? You might get a better body. So the worm says, no, everyone needs, even worms want to go on living. So then there's a whole discourse between Vyasa and the worm, when Vyasa eventually convinces the worm that he should not try to hold on to the worm body. And the Vyasa promises him, if you die now, I'll get you a human birth. So the worm just lies down in front of the cart and is gone. So anyway, this is just one of those little fabulous, mini stories that you find in the Mahabharata and other places. So in a way, you can see that there's so many teachings in that one story, because firstly, we all have this inherent fear of death. Secondly, we can overcome it by knowledge. Even intellectual knowledge is helpful. That's why we have these conferences and discussions, so that we at least understand that there's nothing to fear. So what do we get from studying Jyotish? Firstly, we see, okay, these are the sources of pain, these are the sources of pleasure, and this is when we're going to die. Ultimately, every astrologer has to figure out when they're going to die, to whatever extent they can. And then when you face it, you think, well, fine. I mean, it's such a relief when you just accept. You said, okay, if I'm going to die, at such and such date, fine. What's my problem? So once you get to that point, then it's a huge relief. That's what I'm saying. It's like a blessing. And only through Jyotish can you really, Jyotish is one of the primary ways of helping us with that. Now, this point about this sensing something immortal. We're going to look at Ramana Maharshi's chart in a minute. But Ramana, he advised people to meditate on that inherent sense of something immortal. He says, ask the question, who am I? What is the I that I sense? Because we all sense it, right? Everybody has this sense of it. And it's not just the hormones. When people are young, they think they're immortal because their hormones are strong. But there's something that's behind that, and that we should meditate on it. That was his method. What is this I? Where is it? Try to find it, Now, there's a very interesting yoga called Vasantha Yoga. All of you probably know that Vasantha means springtime, right? So we can apply the 7 or 6 seasons to the chart by giving 2 signs to each season. So Vasantha spring is said to be the 12th Pisces and Aries, which equivalents to, for any particular individual, to the 12th house in the first house. So if this life is the ascendant, and the next life is intimated by the 12th house, then what happens if these get associated? This is the question. What happens if there's a yoga between the 12th house and the first house? So the classic example of the Vasantha Yoga is the conjunction of the Lord of the 12th and the Lord of the 1st. We're going to see other versions of it. And of course, one possible result is a desire for physical union, because that's also in the 12th house. So it's not surprising that at springtime people get a bit fired up. But that's not all that's in the 12th house. If the 12th house is taken as being the the kaivalyam, as it were, then that will also manifest, or at least there's some kind of inspiration or desire to move on that path will manifest. So this is Ramana Maharshi's chart. So what are we looking for? We're considering the first house and the 12th house. So we have the 2 houses, we have the 2 lords, but then we have more than that. There are other factors, like we have the karakas. So the karaka of the first house is the sun, and the karaka of the 12th house, for this purpose, is Ketu. We're not taking Shani here. Shani is to do with the sorrow and misery, losses, and all that stuff in the 12th house. Ketu is the karaka for the spiritual realization. So we're taking Ketu. And then the Atma Karaka is important because it's the Karaka that's associated with the first house. We don't really have a Karaka associated with the 12th house, but we should check the Atma Karaka, we should check the sun, we should check the Lagna Lord, and we should see what their relationship is to the 12th house. So what have we got here? The Lagna Lord is Venus, and the Lord of the 12th house is Mercury. Now this, I just took this because the slide, I created the slide before, and I thought this is just perfectly connected to Ramana Maharshi's teaching, so I put his name in the thing. So then I had to show his chart, and then I look at it and I say, oh yes. Everyone looks at that Venus and Mercury in the second house, and they wonder, is this really a saint, you see? But it just happens to be the Lord of the 12th and the Lord of the 1st. That's what really is going on in the second house there. So that's one thing. All right. So then we see the sun is with Rahu. So you think the sun with Rahu is an issue, but what happens about Rahu in this case is the secondary lord of Virgo. So this is something Sanjay teaches, but it's not like he's the only person who understands this. And when you think about it, it's highly rational. Virgo has a strong kind of Rahu tendency, and it's the Mula Trikona, said to be the Mula Trikona of Rahu. So if we take, and you don't have to believe me, you just study charts, and if you pay attention to the connection between Rahu and Virgo, I think after a while you'll get convinced. So Virgo then has 2 rulers, Mercury and Rahu. So Mercury is with Venus, the Lord of the 1st, and Rahu is with the Sun. So Libra rising, and Virgo is the 12th house, and we have Venus and Mercury in the 2nd house. Then we have the Sun with Rahu in the 3rd. The Sun, of course, is the Karaka for the 1st house, and Rahu is the Lord of the 12th house, based on Virgo. The Atma Karaka is the Moon. So the question is, does the Moon have anything to do with the 12th house? So I think that at least there's Rashi Drishti, right? And then what we see is the moon is conjunct Ketu. So what we've been looking for, see, moon is with the Karaka of the 12th house. The Lagna Lord Venus is with the Lord of the 12th house, and the Karaka sun of the first house is with Rahu. So he's got the complete yoga. All the different elements are there. So I'd say this is a sort of absolute classic case of this yoga. Now, this is Ramakrishna Paramahansa, another extremely great one. If you have Aquarius rising, then the Lord of the first and the Lord of the 12th is Shani. And we see here Shani is exalted. So there is a sort of inherent connection for Aquarius. That is one plus point of Aquarius Lagna. Now, what else do we have? We have Rahu is the Atma Karaka. And Rahu, of course, very strong and has a direct Graha Drishti and Rashi Drishti on the 12th house. He also has a very powerful Drishti on Shani. See that? Rashi Drishti, Sammukha Drishti. And Rahu is, of course, the Lord of the first house, secondary, or one of the lords of Aquarius. And then the sun is in Aquarius, and it has Rashi Drishti with Shani, the Lord of the 12th. So this is a, there's a very tight. And then, of course, Ketu is got Rashi Drishti on the 12th house. And the Lord of Ketu, of course, is in the 12th house, exalted. So this is another version of the yoga, but it has every element in it. And we see that Rashi Drishti is quite important for this, because it's not really a Graha Drishti thing. I mean, Graha Drishtis may play a role in terms of making us want to develop. Graha Drishti is about your motivations, or Rashi Drishti is just how it is. So there's both here, actually. I mean, if your Atma Karaka has direct Graha Drishti on the 12th house, it's definitely one of the things that your soul is interested in, and maybe the thing it's interested in. So that is something to watch out for. This is Paramahansa Yogananda. Again, you see the Atma Karaka in the 4th house. There's quite a few charts like that. So the 12th Lord is in the 1st house. I mean, this is a classic. If the 12th Lord is in the 1st house, obviously, well, the 1st Lord in the 12th house is a very strong yoga. Ketu has Rashi Drishti on the moon. It has Rashi Drishti on the Lagna. The Atma Karaka is in Parivartana with Ketu. See that? Venus in Scorpio, Ketu in Libra. And it also has Rashi Drishti on the 12th house. So again, we see it's just there are many possible variations of this. But if we see here, the only thing we're not finding is the sun. The sun does not seem to be so much involved in these yogas, but it is the dispositor of the moon as the 12th Lord. So there's that. This is Sri M. He's currently with us. Great soul. You can find lots of his videos on the YouTube, his talks. It's a very beautiful soul. So he has the Atma Karaka moon with the 12th Lord in the 12th house. So that's a fairly major yoga already. He's a teacher of Kriya Yoga like Yogananda. And they both consider themselves disciples of the lineage of Sri Guru Babaji. We find the sun with Ketu and the Lagna Lord Shani. How is that? You see the sun, Ketu, Shani, Rashi Drishti situation? Of course, sun is dispositing Lagna Lord Shani. So again, we find really all the elements are involved here. The sun, the Atmakaraka, the 12th Lord, the Lagna Lord, everything is involved. And this is Sadhguru, another famous guru who's currently with us. So this is Taurus Lagna with Ketu in the 12th house. The sun is conjunct Mars, which is the Lord of the 12th and the dispositor of Ketu. And the sun has, and Mars, of course, and the Atmakaraka Mercury all have Rashi Drishti on Ketu in the 12th house. Of course, the Lagna Lord's conjunct Jupiter and disposited by the Atmakaraka, but slightly less 12. It's not really a 12th house connection, but all the other factors are there. I think if you have any one factor, you're already halfway down the road. So it's all just a build-up, isn't it? Now, Jupiter, there could be some discussion. I mean, I've had quite a lot of discussion inside my own head about the role of Jupiter, because Jupiter is the natural lord of the 12th house, but it's not the Karaka. So if we take Jupiter, and the Karakas, the thing about a Karaka is that it's Sanjay says the Karaka is the hand of God. So there's something, it's a higher level consideration than the Lord, the Karaka. And Jupiter's Karakas are the 2nd, 5th, 9th, and 11th houses. So Jupiter's primarily making our life work, as well as being representing knowledge and teachers and all that. So for someone who has to do something in this world, and especially who has to be a guru, then obviously Jupiter has to be very strong and prevalent in the chart. And this is what we see here. But the Vasantha Yoga we're considering is more to do with this, the actual self-realization. It's interesting in Sadhguru's case because he has described his previous 3 lifetimes, and there's a progression. So in the 3rd lifetime going back, he died of a snake bite, but he died very consciously. For some reason, he was able to die in a very conscious way, which led to the next lifetime of him becoming a yogi. But the whole lifetime he was doing his sadhana, and it was only towards the end that he met his guru, and he got the tremendous realization or awakening. But at the same time, the guru gave him a job to do, and he couldn't do it in that lifetime. So that meant he had to come back. So he came back, and so this is now the lifetime number 3. So he became, after a relatively short time, his whole consciousness woke up, and he became a famous saint actually in South India. And he tried, seriously tried, but his temperament really wasn't suited to organizing or motivating the masses to do this thing that he was trying to do. And eventually he realized that he wasn't going to make it in that lifetime. So he dropped that body and came back again, and they took a different tack, really. So Sadhguru, this is the 3rd, 4th lifetime, achieved what his guru had asked him to do 2 lifetimes before. So you see the whole progression required much more than just the realization. There was some kind of other factors needed, and probably that Jupiter Venus in the 5th house played a major role. Anyway, this is all speculation. So I got more slides on the Yoga Sutras. Maybe I could do a few more, and then we can have some questions. So we all know that the Yoga Sutras gives us 8 limbs of yoga: yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. So it's very important that these, this is, everybody knows this. Before we talk about Sannyama, I mean, I think we have to realize that all of these elements are elements. They're all limbs. I mean, you really need all your limbs. So yama niyama shouldn't be just like ignored. I think we all know this. So yama niyama are basically some kind of guidelines for a good life. Like good life means not good life in terms of drinking and partying. I mean, good life in terms of developing physical and mental purity. And then asana, as described in the Yoga Sutras, is about being able to sit still. So I had it's an interesting story. A friend of mine, a German friend, he went to visit Brazil. And when he was there, he befriended this guy who was an Amazonian native. I mean, he's from one of these remote tribes that really has very little contact with the world. But somehow he had come out of the tribe as a young man, and he'd joined the Navy. So every now and again, he would get shore leave, and he wanted to go back to his village. So he would go all the way, all the boats and trips and hiking and everything. And eventually he'd get to the outskirts of the city. And then there was a place, and he had to just sit. The elders of the village had told him, well, if you're coming back, you have to stop in this place and stay there until we let you in. So he would literally sit on that spot, and he had to sit completely still without moving a limb. And they would make him sit for like 6 hours or 8 hours. And if he could do it, they let him in, you see, because it proved that and this is from our Ayurvedic point of view, the rajas, the Vedic point of view, that the rajas of the city and all that had not polluted his mind. He was still capable of sitting still. So this is a very, we think of asana as just, standing on a head and all that. But no, actually the asana that's really taught in these yogic texts, especially the Yoga Sutras, is the ability to sit still. And so anyway, that's asana. Pranayama, we know, is to do with the refining the breathing to the point that the breathing stops. And there's absolutely no reason why the breathing can't stop, actually. There's so many cases of yogis sitting for weeks underwater. I mean, they sit underwater because anywhere else they sit, people come and bother them, right? So, and as long as they're in deep meditation, they don't need any oxygen, so it's not a problem. So, I mean, these advanced stages, but I'm just saying, that's what the real purpose of asana pranayama is, to help us develop this. Pratyahara is to do with the, you could say, control over the senses. It's the ability to just be more internal, sort of not be distracted into the external. And then we have the last three, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, which is said to be something called sannyama. So, I know some of you are very familiar with sannyama, but for those who are not, dharana is the effortless flow of attention. So basically what we want is the mind to flow unimpeded on a single object. So you remember at the beginning we talked about, just sitting and looking at something like a leaf. And so it's like, this is what we're practicing, is dharana. And if you can keep that up, it gradually becomes dhyana. Dhyana is when that flow of attention settled on one thing starts to get more and more refined, quieter and quieter. And eventually the quietness turns into complete quietness, and that's samadhi. No awareness of a meditator. All that exists is meditation. It's a state of complete effortlessness. So I thought, just to illustrate, dharana is like ram, 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 Ram. And then dhyana is when it starts to get Ram, 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 finer and finer until there's nothing. It's just samadhi, right? So the whole point is it's a natural progression. You don't have to plan anything. You just start quietly attending to something, and then the rest all happens by itself, really. And the coming together of these three is called Sannyama. So all the Vibhuti chapter in Yoga Sutras, or a significant portion of it, is about how this Sannyama, when applied to certain specific meditations, gives rise to various experiences. These are the things the yogi is supposed to go through in order to, for whatever reason, we can give some different arguments for it, but that's given as part of the practice. Then there's Ishvara Pranadana. I just want to mention this because it's considered very powerful. Devotion to God. I mean, it's mentioned that if you have this devotion to God, it leads directly to perfection in samadhi. It's said to be the easiest way, but of course, getting devotion is not easy. Like, you can't make yourself be devoted. It just either kind of happens or it doesn't. But paying attention to something is the devotion, in a sense. So it's not really a separate path. You know, whatever we're devoted to, we tend to give our attention to it, right? So that is a practice which effectively cultivates devotion. Now, if you reach that state of samadhi, then what you're experiencing is the eternal present. There's only the present. And the Yoga Sutras are very clear that there is no past and there is no future. Because the reality is it's just the present. But in the present exists what we call the past and the future. I think I have a slide on this. Oh, that's something else. Okay, so let's just briefly introduce this concept. So this is very clearly explained in the Yoga Sutras. The past and the future all exist in the present. This is basically Einstein's theory. Einstein said there is space-time. Space and time are just it's a thing, we could say. So according to the point of view of Einstein's physics, everything exists, all the past, the future, everything is present. And it's just that we are, as long as our minds are kind of busy, we get this kind of concept or experience that we're moving along a timeline. But if we stop the whole machinery of perception, initially there's a kind of nothing, but what opens up is the vision of the whole, which includes all of the past, the present, and the future. So this is a sort of magical, it's sort of magical for us who don't necessarily experience this, but it's just the reality, you know, it's a vision of reality. And since everything already exists, it's not a difficult thing to know it. All the possible, whatever it is, you know, that can be known. But the key to knowing it is that silent state of the mind. That is the key to everything. So this is just something I've mentioned here. There's no past or future, only the present. To the yogi who keeps attention on the present, everything is revealed. Now, there was a Swami I met. He just actually came to this town here, Anubhavananda Saraswati. You can find lots of his talks on YouTube. And he gave a talk to the Advaita group, the local Advaita group. And he said, I'll give you one simple formula for developing this, but you won't do it. He said, just stop talking about your past. And when you think about it, it sounds really easy, doesn't it? And then you think about it a bit more and it seems impossible. Because almost everything anybody says usually involves something about their past. I'm sure I've told one or two stories related to my past in this talk. So it's a habit, see? But what he's saying is that if you make an effort, like you make some kind of practice out of not talking about your past, not giving a commentary on the present from your past, then gradually it will weaken that bondage, that kind of the present being trapped by the past. And gradually we'll find ourselves bubbling in the joy of the present. So it's an amazing teaching, and it's so simple, and yet, for most people, it's just not going to happen, right? But it's worth knowing about it. Now, this is a fantastic experience that I mentioned earlier. And this was, I found in, somewhere online. So this guy, at the age of 16, Tony Kofi, fell from the third story of a building. Time seemed to slow down massively, and he saw a complex series of images flash before his mind. As he described it, in my mind's eye, I saw many, many things. Children that I hadn't even had yet, friends that I'd never seen but are now my friends. The thing that really stuck in my mind was playing an instrument. Later, Tony saw a picture of a saxophone and recognized it as the instrument he'd seen himself playing. He used his compensation money from the accident to buy one, and now he's one of an award-winning jazz musician. I think he's quite famous in England. So it's just an illustration of how, it's all there, but it takes some very special circumstance for us to see it. So I thought I'd just mention about the different levels of the body, because this is an important and interesting concept. So we have our gross body. That's the one we think we are. Then we have the subtle body, the sukshma sharira. And this carries the vasanas, all the latent desires, the latent desires, things like each time you kind of think, I really like that. And then for some reason you can't get it, right? So it just becomes a latent desire. It's a seed. And as long as there's any seeds, the sukshma sharira continues. And as long as the sukshma sharira continues, we keep on being born again and again in order to satisfy those desires. So, what they say, be careful what you want, what you desire. And then beyond that, there's the karana sharira, which is the causal body, which is the one that carries the eye sense. And also the latent impressions. So if you actually get to a stage where you really don't want anything, like you kind of exhausted all of the bucket list, the desires, then when the body drops, then the sukshma sharira will actually literally fade away. And all that will remain is the karana sharira. Now you don't have any desire for any new bodies, but the eye sense still continues and the potentiality to have a new body exists. So if there's some reason for taking some form, there might be some reason, like your guru asks you to do something, you haven't done it yet. So then the form can manifest from the karana sharira, even without the sukshma sharira. I mean, I don't know, maybe some temporary sukshma sharira appears for the sake of, I don't know about that, but this is the basic understanding as I've understood it from the yogis I've listened to and reading the Yoga Sutras and its commentaries. So this karana sharira is that awareness of existence without any kind of identification with it. And the final stage of the whole yogic process is the dissolving of the karana sharira. When it's gone, there's definitely no more taking birth. So this is one small thing I promised I teach or describe. I mean, I just thought it was very interesting. So since I promised I'd say it, I'll go over it. So in the last chapter, in verse 7, he explains that the karma of the yogi is neither black nor white. In other words, there's no karmic consequences of anything the yogi does. Other people have karmic consequences where they do good things, bad things, or mixed things. So in verse 8, it said that the last three types of karma manifest. and they manifest according to the subconscious impressions. In other words, because of some karma you have, according to the circumstances, if the circumstances are favorable for that karma to manifest, it will manifest. So the subconscious impressions related to that karma will just come up. And then 9 explains that regardless of how old the impressions are or how distant in space, in other words, it could be thousands of years since that karma was deposited, we could say, those impressions. But when the right circumstances arise, it still arises. So it's not anything to do with really time and space. It's just the circumstances. So if you're born as a cat, only those impressions and feelings arise that are associated with that kind of birth. It doesn't matter that in previous births you were in other bodies. They don't impinge on this lifetime because they're not appropriate, you see. Now, from this you can interpret, this is my little take on it, is that if you contemplate on any form, like your cat, then it's possible that some of the memories of previous associations that form can arise. So that's just a little tease, I guess. But it just shows, whatever you choose to contemplate on, whether it's a form or some culture or anything, there's a possibility that any connections that you might have had in some previous lifetime with that form or culture or whatever it is will start to manifest, and you continue contemplating on it. You may even remember your past experiences. So this is how you can actually remember your past lives. This is the technique for it. But you have to be patient. Thank you.
Thank you. So just on this, you're making the connection between the first house, the 12th house, and the first house, and the karika, the sun, and the Atma karika.
Yes, you see the Vasantha Yoga, the longing for union. But if we take the 12th house from a purely spiritual point of view, then we see the longing for spiritual union. And so there's the lords, there's the houses, but also the karakas. I was giving importance to the karakas. And the Atma karaka, because obviously it represents the soul, and it's also the karaka for the first house. So it's the sun, the Atma karaka, the Lagna Lord on the one side, and the 12th house, the Lord of the 12th house, and Ketu on the other side. So
what was the yoga called again? The longing
Vasantha. Vasantha means spring. So it's said that Pisces and Aries are the signs of spring. And, people get this longing for union when spring starts, right? But that's mainly to do with Venus. And it's one of the karakas for the 12th house for a specific type of union, right? So Sanjay was teaching that the other day, but I thought I'd take it a little further and apply it to spirituality. Because if you look in the classical Jyotish texts, when they do talk about spirituality, it's always to do with the 12th house, the first house, and Pisces.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Ketu, these are the things. So I just slightly developed on that. So you can see with all kinds of different lagnas, you can get these combinations. And it's just Ramana Maharshi. I mean, he was the one that, I was led to this from his teachings. And then when I put up his chart, I realized that this is the perfect example because it's absolutely everything is there. So he didn't need any help. He just fell into it, really. So what you can see is that there's no distraction in this chart at all. I'd always been a bit confused about the Venus and Mercury, but As soon as I looked at this chart from this point of view, I realized what they represent. And I hope that I've given you something to think about.
Yeah, there is a question from John. I don't know if you can see that. Does a stable experience of Sannyama invalidate the need for Jyotish? Also, does karma exist for a person who has a stable experience of Sannyama?
Sannyama.
Yep.
Yeah, Sannyama. Sannyama. So the point is, Sannyama itself is not an experience, it's a process which includes the dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. Basically, you start with you're meditating on something, and then it fades and fades, and it becomes the pure silence. And then out of the pure silence comes the knowledge of that thing you were meditating on. That's as I understand it. And I gave a little reason at the beginning why that doesn't validate Jyotish, because Jyotish is a kind of, we could say it's a verification. Like you have a vision of the future, and then the question is it true? Or maybe you're completely convinced it's true, but then there may be details that you didn't see, like when is it going to happen? What are the other factors? There are many things that you may not see in your vision. See, like a psychic may see something, but she may not be able to tell you anything more about it than what she saw. But if you can look at the chart and see, is this likely to happen? And then if you identify it in the chart, you can start giving more details, because the chart provides essentially means to extract all the details.
Okay.
Now, if you're actually, like it says in the Yoga Sutras, one of the slides, that the karma of the yogi is neither black nor white. So the yogi is doing karma, but is not creating any kind of future mess for himself or herself. You know, there's no real consequence of that karma. It's not going to generate future lifetimes. But that's a yogi. That's somebody who's established in yoga, not just a beginner experiencer. So maybe that stable experience of Sannyama is something close to being a yogi.
Okay. Gordon has just added Vasantha comes from Vas, to be bright, or
yes,
I think shine like the dawn.
Exactly. It is like the dawn, because the first house is the sort of.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And a question from Barry. Does the Atmakarika in the 12th suggest a deep longing of the soul for moksha?
I would think so. We had one example of that, didn't we? One of these charts.
And does it simultaneously show the block, because it is part of the challenges of this incarnation?
Well, I mean, the fact is we're all born ignorant. I mean, even this like Sadhguru, he got enlightened multiple lifetimes ago, and he had to be born twice more. And this is according to what he's described. And each time he was reborn, initially he wasn't enlightened. You know, it sort of it just manifested itself at a certain point. So, all of these great ones, they start, from an early age, perhaps they start manifesting high degrees, states of consciousness, but you're not born enlightened unless you're some kind of avatar. So does that answer the question? I think wherever the Abhakarika is definitely, I think Barry's right, clearly shows. I mean, the Shriyam, I mean, he must be born just for this, his guru and his realization.
Jaya's she points out that Satguru's Atmakarika, Mercury, is retrograde. So maybe that shows the multiple efforts.
Maybe 3 times. It could be. I don't know, because it's this chart of this lifetime.
Yeah. And then Steve is asking, can we also add the fourth house and the fourth lord as characters as lead moksha house?
Well, maybe. I mean, you could start expanding the whole concept. I'm only done a first step of this,
Okay.
but the classics do tend to emphasize on the 12th house and the first house. So, I mean, in that earlier talk I gave, I did go through 4th house, 8th house to get to the 12th house, but there are, you may get distracted along the way, because it's only when you arrive at the 12th house that really the chance of the actual moksha is arising. So anyway, Steve, do look into that. That could be very interesting.
Yes, he points out that's in Ramana Maharishi's chart. Fourth lord is in Pisces, aspecting the sun, Atmakarika, and the 12th house. So.
Absolutely. That's right. 4th house is aspecting the fourth lord is aspecting the 12th house by Rashi and Graha Drishti. Brilliant, Steve.
And the sun. Yeah.
There's no joy. I mean, he was not interested in anything else, was he? Absolutely not interested.
Okay. Oh, because you're on again shortly to do the software demonstration. So thank you very much for that, Andrew. It was an outstanding lecture. And again, lots of deep principles that we're going to have to think about. There's introduced lots of new things for me, anyhow, in my infinite ignorance. So thank you for giving me some insights into the areas that I've never tread before. Thank you very much indeed. And we'll see you shortly at round about 7:00-ish UK time.
Great.
Thank you very much indeed.
Great. Thank you.